Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really fascinating chapter of history. We're going to trace this spectacular leap in ancient Indian art, literally the moment in time when artisans went from creating these somewhat stiff, flat stone carvings to producing dynamic, deeply voluminous, and just brilliantly painted masterpieces. It is quite literally the story of stone coming to life.
Here's our agenda for today. Think of it as our roadmap. We're going to cover new empires, new art, head over to Barhut for sculpting the narrative, look at the art of storytelling, travel to Mathura for perfecting the form, step inside Ajanta for caves of color, and wrap it all up with the evolution of Indian art. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. New Empires, New Art, the Post-Mauryan Landscape.
Okay, so to really understand the art, we've got to understand the politics, right? Because art doesn't happen in a vacuum. Starting around the 2nd century BCE, the massive unified Mauryan Empire begins to fragment and new powers step up. Up north and in parts of central India, you've got the Shungas, the Kanvas, the Kushanas, and later the Guptas taking control. Meanwhile, down in the southern and western regions, dynasties like the Satavahanas and Vakataks are taking charge. It's a massive shift.
And because power is decentralizing with all these new patrons, we see this absolute explosion of localized artistic workshops. I mean, they're popping up all over the map. You've got Vidisha and Bharhut in Madhya Pradesh, Bodh Gaya over in Bihar, Mathura in UP, Kandagiri and Udagiri in Odisha, right down to Baja and Pevani in Maharashtra, which actually brings us to the very first major stop on our tour.
Section 2. Barhut, Sculpting the Narrative.
We arrive at Bharhut. Now, you really have to think of the artisans here as being completely at the drawing board. They're just starting to figure out how to project a human body out of a solid block of stone. Take a look at this Yakshini figure. Notice how her folded hands cling perfectly flat against her chest, and her feet are positioned just a bit awkwardly. This is a perfect example of the early constraints of shallow carving. Because they weren't cutting deep into the stone yet, everything had to stick strictly to the picture plane, giving the whole body this kind of general stiffness.
But listen, what these early sculptors lacked in 3D volume, they absolutely made up for in pure visual storytelling. They were brilliant communicators. Check out this incredibly charming relief panel depicting Queen Mayadevi's dream. You can clearly see the queen reclining on her bed, and right there at the top, a little descending elephant heading straight toward her. It's such a simple, direct, and highly effective way to convey the story of the Buddha's conception.
Section 3. The Art of Storytelling, Decoding the Past.
So the real magic here is how these ancient artisans managed to communicate incredibly complex Buddhist lore, specifically the Jataka stories, which are tales of the Buddha's past lives, using such limited space. What's really fascinating is how this carving operates almost exactly like an ancient comic book panel, but totally devoid of strict, square borders.
They used this ingenious continuous narrative technique. Look at how they literally crammed 3 distinct moments in time into this one single circular frame to tell the story of the Ruru Jataka. Down at the bottom, there's the bodhisattva deer rescuing a drowning man on his back. Over on the right, the king stands ready, drawing his bow to shoot the deer. And right smack in the middle, the very guy who was rescued is pointing his finger, betraying the deer to the king for a reward. It is just a masterclass in visual compression.
Now keep that early stiffness from Barhut in the back of your mind, because to truly appreciate this next major leap in art history, we have to compare it to what happens next. We are moving from shallow carving and flat hands straight into a revolution of deep carving, pronounced volume, and this incredibly sophisticated interplay of light and dark.
Section 4. Mathura, Perfecting the Form.
All right, fast forward to Mathura during the Kushana period. This is where the stone literally awakens. There's a great quote from our source text that perfectly captures this. The interplay of light and dark is given considerable attention by using the curving and protruding planes of the eye socket and the planes of the nose. Think about that. Instead of just etching an outline, they're physically curving the stone to force shadows and highlights to do the heavy lifting. It makes the faces look so incredibly lifelike.
You can clearly see the hallmarks of this new Mathura style in masterpieces like the seated Buddha at the Cotter Mount. The bodily volume is highly pronounced. The face has this profound, expressive calmness. You'll notice the elongated earlobes and just a wonderfully smooth surface treatment.
What's also super cool is how Mathura acted as this cultural melting pot, pulling in Achaemenian, Parthian, and Bactrian visual traits and blending them into something distinctly Indian.
Section 5. Ajanta, Caves of Color.
And all of this mastery builds right into our final climactic stop on this explainer, the breathtaking Ajanta Caves. But before we look at the art inside, we actually need to talk about the space itself, the chaitya. A chaitya was essentially an apsidal, vault-roofed prayer hall, almost always featuring a stupa right at the back. These were the grand, intricately carved monastic centers where this incredible art was housed. Okay, look at this stunning side-by-side. On the left, check out that complex, highly voluminous overlapping of figures carved straight into the rock of an Ajanta chaitya. And then on the right, the world-famous, vibrantly painted Padmapani mural. By this period, artists aren't just making naturalistic figures anymore. They're arranging them into these highly complex, dynamic compositions that just explode with animated movement and storytelling.
And the way they painted these murals? Absolute ancient engineering genius. Inside places like Cave 4, famously known as the Rang Mahal, or the Palace of Colors, they used this really painstaking methodology. First, they'd slather the rough cave walls with a thick, reddish-brown, gritty mud plaster. Then, they'd seal it with a smooth layer of lime priming. Finally, they'd paint the vibrant temper murals right on top. That exact chemical and structural layering is literally why these colors have survived for millennia. No way, right?
Section 6. The Evolution of Indian Art. When we step back and look at the whole picture, the journey is just awe-inspiring. We go from the flat, shallow, highly constrained carvings of early Barhut to the astonishing 3D modeling of Mathura, all the way to the vivid, dynamic murals of Ajanta. It represents an unmatched technological and artistic leap in human history.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. When you think about how those ancient carvers managed to efficiently compress time and space into a single frame just to tell a story, you've got to wonder, how much of our modern visual communication, our graphic novels, our digital interfaces, the stuff we scroll through every single day, is still fundamentally rooted in the genius of those early stone carvers? It's pretty wild to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the awakening of form. Keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next explainer.